The glass hit the bar top hard enough that the bartender flinched before I did. My name is Ryan Coleman. I'm 34. I inspect commercial buildings for a living. The kind of job where you learn to spot the hairline crack before it becomes the collapse. And on the night my wife stood up in front of 60 people at Miller's Tavern and told the whole room, laughing, that she'd married the most boring man in Tulsa, I didn't see it coming. Even though spotting failure before it happens is supposed to be my entire professional skill set. We were 7 years into a marriage I would have described, up until that night, as good. Not perfect. Good. Vanessa and I met at a mutual friend's barbecue. Married 18 months later, bought a small brick house in Brookside with a crooked porch step I kept meaning to fix, adopted 2 dogs, and built the kind of Sunday dinner, dishwasher argument, ordinary happy life that I'd spent my whole adult life quietly hoping for, ever since watching my own parents' marriage fall apart loudly when I was 12. I built my entire adult self around not repeating that. I showed up. I didn't raise my voice. I remembered anniversaries. I believed, without examining it too closely, that showing up consistently was the same thing as being loved. That night at Miller's was supposed to be a birthday party for Vanessa's coworker Dana. No relation to Vanessa's actual sister, also named Dana. A coincidence that would cause exactly one confusing conversation later in this story and nothing more. Someone handed Vanessa a microphone as a joke, 2 drinks into the evening, and instead of a toast, she gave the room a performance. A string of little jabs dressed up as affection, each one landing half a second too hard to be fully a joke. He alphabetizes the spice rack. He's never once been spontaneous in his life. I love him, God help me, but I married a man who thinks a wild Friday night is finishing a home inspection report early. People laughed. I laughed too, because that's what you do at the edge of your own humiliation in a room full of people who love you. You laugh along so nobody else has to feel the thing you're actually feeling. But I noticed something I wouldn't be able to name for weeks. The way Vanessa's eyes flicked, once, toward a group near the back of the bar, right before she delivered the meanest line of the whole bit, as if she were checking whether someone specific was laughing too. I didn't know his name yet. I would, in 3 weeks, and it wouldn't come from Vanessa's mouth. It would come from a manila folder a man named Frank Delgado slid across a diner table, and by the time that folder was open, I would already have spent 3 weeks quietly, methodically, becoming a different kind of husband than the one who'd stood there laughing at his own expense. Before that night, if you'd asked me to describe my marriage, I'd have used the word steady. We weren't a couple people wrote songs about, but we were solid, the kind of solid I'd been taught, by the collapse of my parents' marriage, to treat as the entire point. Vanessa worked in event planning, a career built on chaos, vendor emergencies, last-minute cake disasters, brides who called her at midnight. And I worked in concrete and steel, a career built on the opposite, on things staying exactly where you calculated they would stay. For years, the difference between us felt like balance instead of distance. She handled spontaneity. I handled certainty. It worked, or I believed it did. The way you believe a beam is holding weight right up until the day you finally run the numbers and discover it's been quietly failing for longer than you wanted to know. The humiliation at Miller's should have been the first crack I noticed. It wasn't. I filed it, that night, under a category I'd been filling for years without realizing how full it had gone. Vanessa's had a couple drinks. She gets a little sharp sometimes. It doesn't mean anything. I want you to remember that category. It's going to come up again. The weeks after Dana's party went back to normal fast enough that I let myself believe the whole thing had just been one bad night, fueled by tequila and a microphone that shouldn't have been handed to anyone 3 drinks in. Vanessa apologized the next morning, sheepish, hungover, blaming the alcohol, and I accepted it quickly, the way I accepted most things from her, without asking for more than she offered, because asking for more had always felt, in our marriage, like making a scene out of nothing. But something had shifted, the kind of shift only a person trained to check load-bearing walls notices right away. Vanessa started taking her phone into the bathroom when it rang. Small thing. I clocked it and said nothing, because saying something felt like accusing her of something I didn't yet believe. That same month, she picked up a new client account, a wedding venue launch out in Broken Arrow. Huge account. Could be the biggest thing I've landed all year, and it required, apparently, a lot of after-hours calls and a lot of late nights at her office. I didn't question it. Vanessa had always worked hard, and event planning had always eaten into evenings the way my job never did. I told myself this was simply a big month for her career. There was a Tuesday, early in that stretch, when she came home smelling like a cologne that wasn't mine and wasn't her usual perfume either, something sharper, more expensive, and when I mentioned it, lightly, not even really a question, she said, "Oh, that's probably Marcus, the client's marketing guy. He's always got some ridiculous cologne on. It's like standing next to a candle store." She said the name so easily, so naturally, that I filed it away without a second thought. That's the detail I would return to later and turn over and over in my mind. How smoothly a name can be handed to you as nothing, when it's actually the entire story. Looking back now, that was the first thread. I just didn't know yet what it was attached to. Around the same time, a second, smaller thread began, one that had nothing to do with Marcus at first and everything to do with money, though I wouldn't connect the two for another month. I noticed our joint savings account, the one we built slowly over 5 years toward a kitchen renovation we'd been talking about since we bought the house, had dropped by almost $4,000 over 6 weeks. In withdrawals, Vanessa explained, when I asked, "As client deposits I front sometimes and get reimbursed for later. It's normal in this business. Don't worry about it." I didn't push. Vanessa had always handled the household budget with more confidence than I did, and I told myself, again, that this was simply how her business worked, a category error I would come to recognize, much later, as its own quiet form of looking away. My best friend Jason noticed something was different in me before I said a word about any of it, which tells you something about how good I'd gotten at not looking. We grabbed beers one Thursday, and he asked, out of nowhere, "Everything good with you and Vanessa?" I said, "Sure, fine, why?" He shrugged and said, "You just seem like you're bracing for something lately." Forget I said anything. I didn't forget it. I just didn't do anything with it either. Vanessa's girls' nights started increasing around then, twice a week instead of the once-a-month standard we'd settled into over the years, and each time she came home a little later than she'd said, a little more careful about checking her makeup in the hallway mirror before coming to find me. A habit that, on its own, meant nothing, but that I noticed anyway, the way you notice a small crack in drywall you're not yet worried about. I want to stop here for a second, because if you've ever caught a detail that didn't fit and talked yourself out of noticing it, not because you're stupid, but because the alternative was more than you were ready to carry, you already know exactly what those weeks felt like for me. There was a parallel pressure building at my own job that month, one that had nothing to do with Vanessa, but that I've come to understand, looking back, sharpened something in me that mattered later. My supervisor, Greg, asked me to sign off on a structural inspection for a strip mall renovation on Memorial Drive that I knew, from the readings I'd taken myself, had a compromised support beam that needed real remediation before occupancy. Greg wanted it signed clean. The developer was a friend of his, the timeline was tight, and everybody rounds a little. "Ryan, it's not going to fall down next week." I refused. I redid the inspection myself, documented everything in writing, and told Greg I'd put my findings in the file whether he liked it or not. It cost me a week of tension at work and a chilly relationship with Greg that lingers even now. But it also reminded me, at exactly the moment I needed reminding, what it actually felt like to hold a line when holding it was inconvenient, a muscle I would need, very soon, in a completely different part of my life. The wedding venue account apparently required a site visit out of town, a long weekend in Eureka Springs for a walkthrough with the ownership group, and Vanessa was gone from Friday morning to Sunday night. She texted throughout, normal enough messages, a photo of a chandelier in some ballroom, a complaint about spotty hotel Wi-Fi. I didn't think much of it. I picked her up from the airport Sunday night, and she seemed distracted the whole drive home, checking her phone twice before we'd even left the parking garage, and when I asked how the trip went, she said long, and nothing more, staring out the window the rest of the ride like she was somewhere else entirely. I didn't know it then. This is what she was living through that weekend. She told me much later. I told myself the whole flight down that this would be the last time. That's what I always told myself before I went. This is the last time, and then I'll figure out how to end it properly, quietly, without anyone getting hurt. Marcus picked me up from the airport instead of a shuttle, and the second I saw him waiting there, I felt this rush that terrified me more than it thrilled me, because it meant I still wanted this, even after telling myself for 2 weeks that I didn't. We had 2 days that felt like a different life entirely. No schedules, no arguments about the dishwasher. Just someone who looked at me like I was the most interesting person in the room. I called Ryan Saturday night from the bathroom of Marcus's hotel room, and I remember standing there mid-conversation, looking at myself in the mirror, thinking, I don't even recognize this person anymore. I told myself I'd end it as soon as I got home. I believed it every single time I said it. That's what she told me, much later. I knew none of it yet. Sitting there in the airport parking garage, just grateful she was finally home. The suspicion didn't arrive all at once. It arrived the way water arrives in a basement you didn't know how to crack, slow, quiet, and then suddenly ankle-deep before you understand how it got there. I found a hotel loyalty confirmation email open on the shared family laptop. Not hidden, not password protected, just sitting there in a browser tab she'd forgotten to close, for a Hampton Inn in Eureka Springs, and beneath the reservation details, a note. Room upgraded to king, compliments of MR. I stood there a long moment reading those 3 letters, telling myself there were 100 explanations, that maybe it was some hotel manager, some ownership contact, a coincidence of initials in a town full of Michaels and Marks and Reginalds. I didn't ask her about it directly. I want to be honest about that, because it's the part of this story I'm least proud of. I had the email open, I had the initials, and instead of asking the direct question, I asked a soft one. How'd the room turn out? They get you something decent? Giving her every opportunity to lie to me easily, which she took without hesitation. Fine, standard room, nothing special. I didn't ask why standard and compliments of MR didn't match. I closed the tab and told myself I was being paranoid. That was the moment I should have asked the question I kept avoiding. I called it a coincidence then. I wouldn't call it that anymore. Jason noticed the change in me before I said a word about any of it. And one night he sat me down at his kitchen table and said, Ryan, whatever it is, just say it out loud. You've been carrying something for weeks. I told him about the cologne, the initials, the money, the girls' nights that had doubled in frequency. He didn't tell me I was crazy. He didn't tell me I was right either. He just said, you need to know, one way or another. Not knowing is going to eat you alive faster than knowing will. Something happened at a family cookout 2 weeks later that I still think about more than almost anything else in this story. Vanessa's phone buzzed on the picnic table, face up, and I caught, for less than a second, a notification preview, a name, Marcus R., and 3 words beneath it before the screen went dark. Can't stop thinking. She grabbed the phone so fast the table shook, and when I asked, lightly, who that was, she said, work thread, Marcus is impossible, always blowing up my phone about vendor logistics. In a voice that came out a half-beat too fast, too smooth, an answer that had clearly been rehearsed for exactly this moment, even though she hadn't known it was coming. Vanessa's sister Dana was at that cookout, sitting close enough to have seen the whole thing, and I noticed, though I didn't understand its meaning until much later, that Dana's face didn't register surprise at all. Not confusion, not concern, nothing. Just a careful, practiced blankness. The specific stillness of a person who already knows a thing and has decided, deliberately, not to react to it in front of others. I filed that away too, one more piece in a drawer that was quietly filling faster than I wanted to admit. I didn't say anything else about the phone. I sat there holding a paper plate of potato salad, feeling something crack open in my chest that I couldn't yet name, some old certainty about my own life giving way beneath me while everyone around us kept talking about football. That was the second turning point, though I didn't recognize it as one yet. The moment I stopped believing her explanations and started, instead, simply cataloging them, the way you catalog evidence rather than accept testimony. Something in me had already made a decision. I just hadn't told the rest of me yet. I called Jason that night. He gave me a name, Frank Delgado, a private investigator he'd used once for a workplace matter, discreet, thorough, the kind of guy who didn't ask questions about why you were asking questions. I stared at the number in my phone for 2 full days before I called it. If you've ever watched someone else at the table not react to something that should have surprised them and understood, without anyone saying a word, that they already knew, you understand exactly what that cookout felt like for me. Frank Delgado met me at a diner off 71st Street. A man in his 50s with the unhurried manner of someone who'd stopped being surprised by human behavior a long time ago. I told him everything. The cologne, the initials, the notification, the doubled girls' nights, the missing money. He wrote almost none of it down, just nodded, occasionally asking a clarifying question, and told me, at the end, I can tell you something in 2 weeks. Might be nothing. Might not be. It wasn't nothing. The first update came 10 days later. Vanessa's car, parked for 2 hours on a Tuesday evening at a condo complex off Riverside Drive, registered, according to Frank's research, to a Marcus Reyes, 36, marketing director for exactly the wedding venue account Vanessa had spent 2 months telling me about. I sat with that information for an entire day before doing anything with it, feeling something that wasn't quite shock, more the specific, sick relief of finally having a name for a shape I'd been sensing in the dark for weeks. The financial thread converged with the affair thread that same week, and this is where the story stopped being simple. Frank, digging a little further at my request, found that several of the client deposit withdrawals from our joint savings had gone through a circuitous path involving a separate account Vanessa had opened without telling me, toward payments on a Broken Arrow condo lease. Marcus's condo, the same one on Riverside Drive. She hadn't just been unfaithful. She'd been quietly funding the affair with money we'd been saving for 5 years toward a kitchen we'd never gotten around to building. There was a moment that week where I came close to confronting her with just what I had, the address, the name, the money, before I'd built the fuller picture, and Jason talked me out of it late one night on the phone. If you show your hand now, she has time to clean everything up before you have anything solid, he said. Wait. Gather everything first. I hated waiting. But some part of me, the inspector's part, understood that a partial finding gets you nothing. You need the whole structural picture before you can make a determination that holds up. Frank's second update, 2 weeks in, included photographs. Vanessa and Marcus at a restaurant in Broken Arrow, 30 minutes from any client meeting either of them had reason to be having, her hand resting on his forearm across the table in a gesture I recognized because I'd seen her make it toward me 100 times over 7 years. There were time-stamped hotel entry logs from the Eureka Springs trip, placing Marcus checking into the same Hampton in 4 hours before Vanessa's flight even landed. There were text excerpts Frank had obtained through channels he didn't fully explain and I didn't fully ask about. Months of messages reading like a whole second marriage conducted entirely in the negative space of our real one. I sat in my truck outside Frank's office with that folder in my lap for nearly 40 minutes before I could make myself drive home, my hands doing something strange and unsteady that I didn't fully recognize as my own body's fear response until later. There's a moment I have to include here because it complicates the story in a way I didn't expect. I went to Vanessa's mother, Carol, that same week. Not to expose anything, just to ask, carefully, obliquely, whether Vanessa had seemed stressed lately, hoping for some innocent context that might undercut what I already suspected. Carol, without meaning to, without any idea what she was actually confirming, said, "Oh, she's been so busy with that Broken Arrow account. She was even asking Dana to cover for her with some scheduling thing a few weeks back. You know how she gets when a project's this big." I asked, gently, what kind of scheduling thing? Carol didn't know details. She genuinely didn't. But the sentence itself was enough. Dana had been asked to cover for Vanessa. Dana had known, or at least suspected, weeks before that cookout where she'd sat so carefully blank-faced beside the buzzing phone. I didn't say anything to Carol. She had, without realizing it, become the accidental catalyst that connected 2 threads I hadn't yet linked, the sister's silence and the affair itself. I drove home from her house with one more piece of the picture I hadn't asked for and didn't know what to do with yet. I made a decision that week I'm still not entirely proud of. Instead of confronting Vanessa immediately, I sat on the full folder for 6 more days, watching her, testing small things, asking questions I already knew the answers to just to hear exactly how far she'd go to lie to my face. I asked about a team dinner I knew, from Frank's log, had actually been a dinner for 2 at Marcus's condo. She described a restaurant, a seating arrangement, a colleague's birthday toast, none of which existed. I listened to the whole fabrication without flinching, and something in me, watching her build an entire fictional evening out of nothing, hardened in a way I hadn't expected. I don't say this proudly. Letting her keep lying, once I already knew, was its own kind of manipulation, even if it didn't feel that way at the time. It felt like protecting myself, gathering just a little more certainty before I let go of the life I'd spent 7 years building. But I understand now that I used those 6 days as much to punish her quietly, in a way she couldn't see, as I used them to prepare. By the end of that week, I had everything Frank could give me: photographs, timestamps, message logs, hotel records, bank records, laid out in a folder on the passenger seat of my truck, and I understood, finally, that there was no version of this where I could keep pretending the beam was holding. I asked Vanessa to sit down on a Sunday evening. The dogs already put out back, the house quiet in the particular way houses get right before something in them changes permanently. She sat across from me at the kitchen table where we'd eaten 1,000 ordinary dinners, and I set the folder down between us, unopened, and said, "I know about Marcus, and I know about the money." I watched her face do several things in quick succession: a flicker of calculation, a fast attempt at composure that didn't hold. "Ryan, I don't know what you think you." I opened the folder. I didn't raise my voice. I laid the photographs out one at a time, methodically, the way I lay out inspection findings for a client who doesn't want to hear that their building has a problem, plainly, without editorializing, letting the evidence make the argument I didn't need to make myself. The restaurant, the hotel logs, the bank transfers routed to the condo lease. A printed excerpt of a text that read, in her own words, "I can't keep pretending this is just work." She went very still. Then the composure broke all at once. Tears, apologies, a rush of words that came out faster than she could organize them. It wasn't supposed to become anything. It started as nothing. I swear to you, it started as nothing. I didn't interrupt her. Some part of me needed to hear whatever came next, needed the full accounting before I could decide what to do with any of it. She finally spoke, really spoke, somewhere in the middle of that unraveling. And this is what she told me, as close to her exact words as I can recall them. It started at the venue kickoff meeting back in the spring. Marcus made some joke about the client being impossible, and I laughed harder than the joke deserved, because it had been so long since anyone made me laugh like that without effort. And I remember thinking, in that exact moment, this is dangerous, and then doing absolutely nothing about it. The first time we crossed a line was after a late work dinner. Nothing happened, just a hug that lasted 4 or 5 seconds too long. And I told myself that a hug wasn't cheating, that I hadn't actually done anything, and I held on to that technicality for weeks like it meant something. Then it was texts. Then it was the first time I lied to you about a location, and I remember standing in my closet before that first lie, staring at my own reflection, telling myself, just this once, it doesn't have to mean anything. You're allowed to feel something without it destroying everything. I was wrong. Every single time I told myself that, I was wrong, and I knew it more each time, and I kept going anyway. The money. I told myself I was just floating it, that I'd put it back before you ever noticed, that it was temporary. I opened a separate account so I wouldn't have to explain a joint statement, and every time I moved money into it, I told myself it was the last transfer, and it never was. I was terrified the entire time, of you finding out, obviously, but almost more of what it meant that I kept choosing to go back. I used to sit in my car outside our house after seeing him, sometimes for 10 minutes, just trying to arrange my face into something that looked like your wife instead of whatever I'd just been. I couldn't look at our wedding photo on the hallway wall some mornings. I started avoiding it, walking the long way around through the kitchen just so I didn't have to pass it. There was one night, maybe 6 weeks ago, where I almost told you everything. I had the words in my mouth, standing right here in this kitchen, and then you asked me how my day was, so normal, so trusting, and I couldn't do it. I chose the lie again. I kept choosing it, every single day, right up until you put those photographs on this table. The room was quiet for a long moment after that. I felt something in my chest that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, something closer to the specific stillness of watching a structure you've spent years trusting finally, fully, show you every crack it had been hiding. "I need you to leave tonight," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected, evidence-driven, the way I deliver a finding I already know the client doesn't want to hear. "Not tomorrow. Tonight. Ryan, please, we can go to counseling. I'll end it completely. I already ended it. I promise you, I ended it the day you found out." "You didn't end it the day you found out," I said. "You ended it the day I caught you. Those aren't the same thing." She cried harder at that, reached for my hand across the table, and I let her hold it for exactly 1 second before pulling it back, not out of cruelty, but because some part of me finally understood that comfort. In that moment, wasn't mine to give her anymore. Jason came by an hour later at my call, mostly just to sit with me while Vanessa packed a bag upstairs, and his reaction was exactly what I needed and nothing more. No lecture, no I told you so, just a hand on my shoulder and a quiet. You did the right thing waiting for the proof before you said anything. Some guys would have blown it up on a hunch. You didn't. Dana called Vanessa directly within the hour, having heard from Carol that something had happened, and I overheard enough of Vanessa's side of that call, standing in the hallway, to understand something I hadn't expected. Dana wasn't comforting her. Dana was furious, not at me, at Vanessa, for the position her silence had put her in, for months of covering scheduling gaps and half-truths that she'd told herself were harmless favors between sisters, and that had turned out to be cover for something she couldn't undo simply by finally admitting it. You made me part of this, I heard Dana say, her voice sharp even through the wall. And I let you, because I didn't want to believe it either. It was the closest thing to an apology I ever got from Dana, indirect, not addressed to me at all, and somehow it landed anyway. The divorce took 4 months, uncontested, mechanical in the way these things become once the emotional argument has already been settled somewhere quieter than a courtroom. Vanessa moved into an apartment off 21st Street. The drained savings became part of the settlement. I was awarded the difference back out of her share of the house equity, a small, unglamorous kind of justice that Frank's paper trail made undeniable rather than debatable. Marcus, according to a mutual acquaintance who mentioned it without my asking, ended things with Vanessa within weeks of the affair becoming public. Apparently, the fantasy required secrecy to survive, and once it became a real, visible, consequence-bearing thing, discussed openly among people who knew them both, he wanted no part of what it actually cost. He was quietly transferred to a different regional office not long after. The wedding venue account itself collapsed amid enough gossip that neither Vanessa's firm nor his kept either of them on it. I want to say I felt satisfaction hearing that. Mostly, I felt tired. The particular exhaustion of watching two people's fantasy collide with reality and neither of them come out of it whole. Dana and Vanessa didn't speak for almost a year after that phone call I overheard. When they finally reconciled, it was on different terms than before. Dana, from what I understand through Jason's wife, no longer covers for anyone, and anything, a boundary she apparently states out loud now whenever it's tested. It cost her something to learn that lesson at Vanessa's expense, and I think she knows it. At work, Greg never brought up the Memorial Drive inspection again, but the building did eventually get the remediation I'd flagged, quietly, months later, after another inspector caught the same issue independently. Nobody thanked me for being right the first time. I didn't need them to. I understood, by then, that holding a line when it's inconvenient rarely gets applauded in the moment. It just becomes, later, the thing that lets you sleep at night. Vanessa reached out twice in the months after, once with a long letter I read once and didn't answer, and once with a phone call I let go to voicemail. The letter said most of what she'd already told me at that kitchen table, dressed up in more careful language, asking for a chance to prove she'd changed. I believed, by then, that she probably meant it in the moment she wrote it. I also believed, with a clarity that surprised me with how little it hurt to hold, that meaning something in the moment had never once been the problem in our marriage. Choosing it, consistently, when no one was checking, that had been the actual test, and she'd failed it for months before I ever opened that folder. I met Sophie about 8 months after the divorce finalized, through Jason's wife, at a low-key dinner that wasn't set up to be anything and somehow became something anyway. She's steady in a way that doesn't ask me to perform steadiness back, and one evening, months into knowing her, I told her the whole story. Miller's Tavern, the folder, the kitchen table, the 6 days I sat on what I knew. She listened without flinching and said, at the end, simply, "That took a lot to hold on to quietly for as long as you did." It was the first time anyone had named that part of the story rather than just the discovery itself, and something in me finally exhaled. I don't hate Vanessa. I want to be honest about that, because it would be a cleaner story if I did. I understand now, more than I did at that kitchen table, that she was a person caught in her own fear and boredom and self-deception, choosing badly, again and again, in ways that had less to do with me than I spent a long time believing. That understanding doesn't undo anything. It just makes the quiet I've found since feel less like anger cooling and more like something closer to peace. The most revealing detail in this whole account isn't the affair itself. It's the 6 days Ryan spent sitting on a folder full of proof, testing Vanessa with questions he already knew the answers to. That choice says something the rest of the story only implies. That discovering a betrayal and truly letting go of a marriage are two entirely separate processes, and the gap between them is where a person's real character gets tested. Ryan used those 6 days to gather a kind of proof that had nothing to do with Frank Delgado's photographs. Proof of exactly how far Vanessa would go to keep lying once the lie no longer served any real purpose except her own comfort. Dana's role complicates the easy version of this story, the one where betrayal belongs to a single villain. Her silence at that cookout, her scheduling favors, her furious phone call afterward, all of it shows how infidelity rarely survives in isolation. It requires small accommodations from people who aren't the ones cheating, people who tell themselves they're just staying out of it, not realizing that staying out of it is itself a kind of participation. Dana paid for that months later, in a fractured relationship with her own sister, a consequence that arrived quietly, without anyone orchestrating it. The financial thread matters more than it might first appear. Vanessa didn't just deceive Ryan emotionally. She redirected years of shared, deliberate saving toward sustaining the deception itself, which reframes the affair as something closer to a second, competing life she was actively funding rather than a lapse she fell into passively. That distinction is part of why reconciliation, once the full picture emerged, was never realistically on the table. The turning point that mattered most wasn't the confrontation. It was the picnic table, the phone buzzing face up, 3 words on a screen before it went dark, and Dana's carefully blank face beside it. That was the moment Ryan stopped believing Vanessa's explanations and started, instead, simply collecting them as data. Once that shift happened, the marriage was already over in every way that mattered. Everything after was just the paperwork catching up to a decision made in silence, over a plate of potato salad. There's a harder question sitting underneath all of it. How many marriages survive not because both people are faithful, but because neither has yet been tested by the kind of opportunity or the kind of quiet family collusion that would reveal whether they actually would be? What stays with me most isn't the folder or the confrontation. It's that Ryan noticed the crack the very first night, at Miller's Tavern, and spent weeks talking himself out of what he'd already seen. I think most of us have done some version of that. Not because we're foolish, but because naming a fear out loud makes it real in a way that silence never does. Here's the question worth sitting with. How many of us are still filing something away under probably nothing, while some quieter part of us has already finished the math? And how many people around us are quietly helping us stay unaware, without ever meaning any harm by it? If someone has ever made you feel foolish for trusting them, or if someone's silence ever cost you more than their lie did, I'd love to hear, in one word in the comments, who that person was for you. Thank you for staying with Ryan's story all the way through. It means something to have it heard by people who understand exactly what that kind of quiet costs.